Welcome to Censored, the podcast that will never get to the end of the filth. I'm Maedhbh Vrtnach, and as I reach the last episode of Season 7, I have to admit that I've yet to be corrupted by a truly bad book. But I do think the language of censorship is getting into my head. Seeing the world through the censor's spectacles might be a teeny bit dangerous. There's something seductive about thinking like a censor, not least because they get all the best lines. The Censorship Act spoke about unwholesome literature, like books were food that could go rotten or putrid. It then goes on to mention unnatural vice, followed by corruption and depravity. It's so bombastic and overblown, but so compelling. I often find myself rolling the words around to savour the madness. I know I'm not alone in my weakness for the rhetoric of censorship, which is why I have invited Dr. Lloyd Maedhbh back again to talk to me about this shared obsession. Hi Lloyd, thank you for coming back to the podcast.
Yeah, can't keep me away like a fart in a lift.
Right, so today we are going to talk, we're going to talk shite really, and we're going to talk in a vague, general way, and have a bit of fun with the mad language that comes up in censorship. Because it's one of the things that I have cited various bits and pieces throughout the episodes, as have you, but you know, it really deserves a bit more focus on the rhetoric and the style and the sort of the texture of it, really, linguistically.
Absolutely, yeah. It's because I think it you know, obviously it tells you so much about the sort of underlying cultural politics of it, and in sometimes like surprising ways, I think. So, you know, obviously it's not inaccurate to think of the Censorship Act and everything that's sort of fed into it and out of it as, you know, belonging to a fairly sort of trite mode of Catholic moral panic. But actually, when you look at the language they use to kind of articulate that panic and the things around which it tends to center, and you start to kind of contextualize that more broadly with like what's happening in other European nations or in other sort of censorship regimes, it both heightens some of the things that are very weird in particular about Ireland, but it also actually exposes continuities that I find certainly quite interesting.
Yeah, it's one of those things where they say things like degeneration and corruption and evil, and it all sounds, quite frankly now, it sounds mental, but it wasn't that unusual for those languages to be used around artistic expressions that were new and foreign. And that's what's fascinating, is that it's part of the zeitgeist in Europe, America and Ireland. You know, it's not just crazy Catholics in Ireland, really.
Gotcha. Yeah. I mean, it's, you know, one of, in my own sort of research, one of my sort of recurring arguments is obviously that, like, yeah, I mean, without going too deep into the sort of historiography around it, obviously there's a fairly long-standing school in the sort of Tom Inglis mode that like points to, you know, the moral monopoly of the Catholic Church as sort of a way to suggest that Ireland never undergoes the sort of invention of sexuality in the kind of medicalized sense that, you know, people like Foucault catalogue. And that Ireland, you know, remains principally in this sort of moral mode of censure and critique. And, you know, to my mind, like, just because someone's wearing a dog collar or a habit when they're, you know, calling you like a degenerate, or when they're, you know, ensuring that certain sections of the population can't reproduce themselves, like by incarcerating them or whatever, you know, that's still eugenics, or that's still, you know, a medicalized policing of sex and desire, even if it's being conducted in this notionally sort of pietistic rhetoric. And a lot of the time the language they're using isn't even that kind of, you know, God-ridden. It's, it is, as you say, indebted to, you know, yeah, kind of that whole sort of Max Nordau language of, you know, degeneration and the idea that, like, it's not just anarchists and criminals who are degenerates, it's also the artist. And Ireland features weirdly, like, Ireland actually kind of ranks fairly high in his sort of list of offenders. Like Oscar Wilde is one of his big kind of exemplary figures of the degenerate turn that contemporary culture was taking. Albeit, I mean, it's before the trial, so it's not so much Wilde's queerness that he's kind of after there. It's the like unseriousness and the flippancy and the kind of self-stylization and the effeminacy, but not necessarily just in the sort of gender non-conforming sense of that. But yeah, so like these lads are far from immune to that kind of that mode of thinking.
And a lot of the people who use the rhetoric around censorship, they're not just priests either. There's a lot of politicians way into this. And they use languages that are really deeply nationalistic and then using that nationalism to, express really profound and quite disturbed Anglophobia. Like that Britain is, and Europe, but Britain especially, is really out to get you and is really like dirty in a physical and moral sense. Like, will actually taint your soul.
Yes, yeah. Oh my God, like the number of images of like effluent, they wax really poetic about how like filthy the English are. I mean, D.P. Moran and people like that, basically like construct a whole, their own idiom of like reprobation for the English with all these kind of nicknames like sludge and bung and I mean he's like D.P. Moran would have thrived in today's internet culture. Like he would have been the king of Twitter.
Do explain for people who don't know who D.P. Moran is. Sorry,
yes. So D.P. Moran was he was the editor of a newspaper called The Leader through it sort of came online in about 1901, I believe, and survived in various forms into the sort of 20s. Its apex of kind of influence on the culture was certainly in the first decade or so of the 20th century. He's also the author of a series of articles that were published as the Philosophy of Irish Ireland, which is a very influential sort of touchstone for a certain kind of Gaelic revivalism. I mean, Moran's definitely one of those people who's like, we should all speak the Irish language. Watch me proceed to use like 3 words of Irish across the entirety of my oeuvre.
He pretty much set the standard for Irish cultural life there, didn't he?
He'll occasionally say that something is Ramesh or so, but that's about as far as we sort of get with it. But even with that, in the Philosophy of Irish Ireland, he talks about, he goes after people like Yeats for perpetuating what he calls this mongrel thing, Irish literature in the English language. And there are like reviews in the Leader of, things like Yeats and George Moore's Dermot and Grania, where the reviewer, I don't know if it's Moran himself, I think it might be one of his sort of staff writers, but you get this reviewer talking about how like the English mind has taken the Irish myth and dragged it through the streets, and like there's this very thinly veiled suggestion of kind of a like sort of sexual assault, and then sort of brought it back to show, to display its kind of mangled dress in front of the green tinted literati who sip their tea like a little green gossip with their tea or so. There's this really sort of, I mean, the underlying politics of this have very little time for. The bitchy elan with which it's doled out, I like gives me life. It's so catty.
I have to say that although, like you say, the politics is so wearisome and really grotesquely disturbed that it's quite upsetting, but the language that they use at times, you can't help but sort of admire them in a twisted way, that they're able to create these effects, that they're able to provoke clearly, I think, very strong emotional responses, because the power of what they've written, it just jumps off the page, really.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I mean, it's also, I think it's and I would say this, but I'm under examined aspect, that I will address in my forthcoming monograph. No,
yes, forthcoming monograph.
Truly, yes. Ooh. Link in the description. There's, I think, something that people have overlooked is the way in which someone like, Joyce, who thrives on verbal excess, he learns a great deal from and takes a great pleasure in this sort of vituperative language. Like, he obviously, again, would be deeply impatient of the sort of purity, the spurious purity that's being kind of fetishized in a lot of this rhetoric. There's a very famous letter he writes to his brother Stanislaus where he's like talking about the lying drivel about pure men and women in love forever that that certain strands of like Sinn Féin are sort of propagating. But he absolutely adores the kind of richness of the language. I mean, it's as you're I guess as we're sort of alluding to here, it's very easy to think of this censorship rhetoric emerging in the second decade of the 20th century, right? Obviously the Act, the Committee on Legal Literature is 1927, the Act is 29. But the groundwork for this is being laid, almost a century before, right? You've got even young Ireland, who are fairly sort of ecumenical. In the Nation, you get these kind of invectives against Benthamy and like the influence of Jeremy Bentham through the English press and how that needs to be kept at bay. And like in the necessity for de-Anglicising Ireland, that kind of manifesto for the revival in a certain mode that Douglas Hyde publishes in the 1890s. He talks about how the Irish need to set their faces sternly against penny dreadfuls, shilling shockers, and still more the garbage of vulgar English weeklies, in favour of everything that is most racial, most smacking of the soil. And, as I and people like Alan Graham, who has a really good chapter about this in a collection on science, technology, and Irish modernism. If your readers are in search of that, or listeners are keen on that. But he talks about how like anxieties about like degeneration and how like the corruption of Ireland by like how Anglicization is figured as like this corrosive sort of infection of the Irish, the purity of Irish culture, in a way that like productively hovers between being sort of literal and metaphorical. Or you get like, hold on, sorry, I mean, you've got me into the sort of like greatest hits of. There's an article in the Leader on Waterford and pernicious literature from 1913.
Pernicious literature, just love it.
The Leader are like just like calling out the anti-pernicious literature campaign of Waterford, being like, lads, you're phoning it in. This isn't up to snuff.
You're missing the real pernicious literature.
Yeah, no. They say that their members seemed content merely to have established their reputations as pillars of Catholicity in the local press, but their ardour has cooled. The literature microbe, we are told, is still with us, but the area of infection is narrowed considerably, that's the committee is pushing back there. Yeah. So even this idea of literature as a microbe is
microbe. Yeah, there was something in the Dáil debates when they are debating the bill, and one of the deputies talked about the second-hand books coming in from Britain, because a lot of the small lending libraries, private lending libraries, were stocked with second-hand stuff that had gone through various iterations in the UK and then moved over at the end of its life because, there wasn't a lot of money in Ireland, so they wanted the cheapest books. And he talked about it like that the books themselves contained actual diseases, like you could catch an actual disease from it, and you would contaminate your mind. So it was a double whammy, like literal and metaphorical filth.
Yeah. With this Waterford thing, they follow up later with like a poem about it. The Waterford boys are no better, it seems, for purging their town of such ill-odoured streams. The dirt that young people's corrupts and destroys receives little check from the Waterford boys. So it's just like, this idea of, English mass culture as a sewage, kind of sewage pipeline just spewing into Ireland, sort of unchecked. Or ill-odoured streams is, it's pretty kind of uncomplicatedly scatological, right?
It's very Joycean, isn't it?
Well, I was gonna... Listen to our Ulysses episode for just how much Joyce appreciated ill-odoured streams.
For a crowd who were claiming not to read it, they were certainly borrowing that sort of imagery, weren't they?
No, totally. And that's the thing, right? There's kind of, and this is, you know, a lot of the sort of early critics of censorship in Ireland are very alive to this, like, you know, Bernard Shaw and to a lesser extent Yeats. I mean, they don't cover themselves in glory in these debates because they're pushing a pretty eugenicist agenda that we can maybe talk about later. But like, one of the things that Bernard Shaw points out is that, like, you know, censorship necessitates a mode of sexually pathological reading almost, you know, of its very nature. Like, if you are looking for filth in everything you read, you will find filth in everything you read. You will be kind of encouraged to interpret everything as inherently sort of sexualized. And I do think that sort of is reflected in the rhetoric. Like, there is a kind of, you know, there is a charge to a lot of the language being used. Like, if you wanted to kind of crudely psychoanalyze this, there's just, you know, you can picture them getting as worked up about how filthy it is as, you know, as you know, those corrupted and depraved by the matter in question might.
There's a sense of this kind of sensationalism, and there are, you know, a lot of over the top, sometimes even gothic kind of hints, I think. But because we are still talking shite, which is an appropriate introduction, I'm going to read out one of my favourite bits. And I read this out before in the Cork Angelic Warfare episode, which, I mean, even the name of them, like, you know, like the Committee of Evil Literature, Angelic Warfare, the whole thing. It's just... Were
they the lads? Did they seize shipments of books by, like, at gunpoint?
Well, they were burning newspapers principally.
Yes, right, yeah. Because Yeats alludes to a society of angelic warfare, like, yeah, kind of seizing matter and putting it to the torch.
Yes, they were a Dominican sodality. I know.
Oh, Ireland.
I know. But yeah, so they had, in 1926, they had was it 50 years of the sodality in Cork? And the Dominican church in Cork is St. Mary's on the Quays. It's actually really beautiful. So they had a guest preacher, and they were talking about how wonderful the sodality is. And this is part of what was quoted in the newspaper, because the great thing, and also the terrible thing about the Cork Examiner at the time, is they devote acres to whatever sermon was going on in whatever Catholic church. I mean, if you want to know what the priests were saying, it's all in the newspapers. So anyway, this was, I can't remember his name. I think he was from another parish. He wasn't a Dominican. It was grand to see the spirit of that sodality triumphing at a time when, in the shape of bad books and so-called literature, the backwash of the dirt of Europe was breaking across our rock-bound coast, even flowing over and leaving a scum on the surface of our fair valleys, and reaching even to the quiet hilltop homes and staining the health. Just...
Staining the health's a gorgeous phrase. You have to give it to them.
Yeah. You know, like, rhetorically, you can hear him saying it, you know?
Yeah, no, exactly, yeah, right, this is like pulpit rhetoric of the highest order, and especially in cold print, it seems, it does seem mad, but you can imagine that working.
And the church was rammed, you know, there were like hundreds of people there for this. Now, is to say they heard it, there's no amplification, but, you know, they were there. They must have heard, like, got at least the tone, I suspect.
Yeah, it's the same sort of, like, tides of filth, sort of.
Yes.
And also, like, that kind of, the topography of purity, or, like, the geography of it, I find really interesting. There's so much of the kind of, again, in ways that are, like, well-worn and unsurprising, there's that kind of, you know, the West, you know, will remain kind of protected and or, you know, is maximally uncontaminated, and it's the cities and the ports. There's a whole kind of Sinn Féin, the publication, not as yet the party, have a series of articles where they, in very thinly veiled sort of terms, talk about the need to, basically in articulating a sort of orthography, you know, we need to be economically autonomous argument about taking over the ports, frames it as a way of, like, stopping, you know, we must stop up our ports to stop the, like, influx of contaminating matter from England into the feminized nation. And it's all, yeah, you know,
it's a bit gross.
And again, for a bunch of people who are like, oh, these lads, they're sullying and corrupting young Irish women. It's like, your metaphors are all like, figuring stuff from England as like dodgy cum. Like, what are you doing, lads? There's a kind of well-worn tendency to like figure this matter in a way that kind of evokes like syphilis as well. Often kind of poxy or wormy or kind of verminous. There's in that vein, one of my I was just looking back through some of the Doyle and Seanad debates over the bill as it's sort of making its way into to the statute books. There's a really fun little anecdote that's shared by a kind of concerned Doyle member who they're an anti-treaty Republican. They're a big Gaelic leaguer. They at least begin the remarks in Irish. I'm not sure the record transcribes it in English. He says, "It is my opinion that just as much harm is done by the cheap novels that are imported by the ton every week. They are distributed to the shops throughout the country, and they are sold in an underhand way. They are bought principally by young girls, I'm sorry to say, and they go into almost every cabin in the country. A short time ago, I had occasion to visit a poor woman in an out-of-the-way place in County Meath, about 3 miles from Maynooth. This woman lived in a two-room thatched cabin, and a storm took away half the roof one night. She asked me to go out to have a look to see if I could do anything for her. This poor woman and I were sitting by the fire in the kitchen. The roof had been taken off the bedroom." Poor woman.
I mean, not playing to type at all in this particular story, no.
It gets better on that front. "I saw on a shelf beside the chimney breast a box with some books in it. 'Biddy,' said I to the woman, 'I see you have some books here. Perhaps there may be some valuable old Irish manuscripts among them.'"
Bless his heart.
Yeah,
like.
I know. May I have a look at them? She said that I might. I took down the box and examined the contents. There are about 10 copies of the Irish Rosary. So far, so good.
Okay, yeah.
And just as many copies of these filthy novels. Novels with attractively coloured covers, with their suggestive, immoral, filthy stories. I looked through one of them to see what they were like, and then I asked her where she got them. She said she got them to read from girls in the neighbourhood. Now, what happened there is happening throughout the country, and, as I said before, these books are principally getting bought by young girls. The result is that the girls are getting a taste for that sort of thing, and their morals are being destroyed. Therefore, I say at least as much attention must be paid to the importation of these books as to the importation of newspapers. I mean, it's like, there's so much happening in that story about, like, you've got this, like, Sean Van Vogt, figure who's, like, and the idea, I can't, obviously hard to get tone from like print. So, maybe his tongue was in his cheek when he's talking about finding old Irish manuscripts, but like this, good on Biddy. Like you get yours, hon. Like you read what you like.
And also isn't ashamed and doesn't deny it when he says, "Can I look at the box?" She's like, "Yeah, sure, whatever."
Yes, yeah, that's what I really love about that anecdote, is that if you read it, against the grain of the moral panic that's being sort of engendered by it, what you basically have is a really fun inversion of traditional narratives of like corruption and censorship, right? So many versions of the kind of imagined reader in censorship are versions of like the vulnerable child, or those into whose hands it may fall. It typically means women, young people, or both, and uneducated people. The kind of educated masculine reader can be trusted to remove himself unsullied from this contaminating matter. But here you've got like an oil one, an oil one being like corrupted by a bunch of local girls who are like, "Sure, read this." This will get you going. In her like half destroyed house.
Well, at least the books would keep her warm,
Also, the temerity of this bastard to come round and be like, "Your roof's off. What are you reading?"
She obviously had him over in the hopes he would direct her towards some scheme to put the roof back on, that she'd be able to apply or get some grant or ask for some money, and instead he's poking around in her private stuff.
Yeah, but also, tellingly, not as you sort of said, not all that private stuff, right? No. It's there on the mantle. It's and she's completely unapologetic about it when questioned. It's one of those things where even within the sort of self-justificatory rhetoric that underpins so much of this. There's a clear sense that like the granular sort of reality of the reading habits of the Irish public are really at odds with what's being done in their name. There's another really fun moment in the debates where and again it's really like kind of unintentionally self-undermining, but another Doyle member talks about like, sure, we don't need sex ed in this country, everyone just watches animals go at it and they learn everything they need. The facts are widely known.
I mean, the basic facts, yes, but
yeah,
perhaps not adequate.
There are things that are not covered in Bull Mounts Cow as a display, but at the same time, there's this sense that no, we must ensure that the plain people of Ireland go uncontaminated by knowledge of sex, which they already possess because they are the plain people of Ireland. There's this circularity to like what, and that happens every time someone conscripts like the peasantry in the name of as an imagined entity in the name of a favored political cause. But it gets really out of hand with this.
What I love about that one about the girls handing out the attractively covered novels. I mean, attractive covers, how dare you? It should be the most boring of plain covers. But in that debate, most of the time, like you say, the person purveying the smut is an Englishman, a man based in England, these filthy newspapers, and he's putting them together and he's undermining the race. But yet in his story, you have Irish Colleens, the epitome of St. Bridget and Mary, and here they are with their filthy books, giving them to the old ladies.
And I mean, and you can obviously you can track that forward into or situate that within a sort of emerging panic around the single young woman, right? Maria Luddy obviously has written very extensively on that score, as have others, about the sort of the emergence of. I think certainly Luddy's argument is that in the absence of the British to kind of as a presence in Ireland to blame for things, it's now young women who are going to the bad. It's the kind of the unmarried amateur, in terms of sex work, or the young girl at the dance. Like that's what's going to kind of lead people astray. Like watching conservative Irish politicians try and figure out who to blame for things like the presence of venereal disease in Ireland after the British garrison is gone is one of the funniest things. It's like it really gets very kind of gymnastic in how the thing. There's also on that note of kind of the conspiratorial element of this. Oliver Gogarty, who makes some fucking heinous contributions to these debates. Really, he's very anti-contraception, but manages to mobilize some really racist and kind of anti-Semitic rhetoric to kind of explicate that. But in terms of what the counterexample is in England, which we can maybe circle back to. But one of the things that he talks about in some of his contributions to the Shauna debates are like how he says we need to ban the posting of marriage notices, because when marriage notices are posted, that's when all of the English contraceptive companies start writing to Irish women to offer them contraceptives.
What?
It's really...
Where would they find the marriage notice? In the papers?
Yeah. He was basically saying like that's we need to get rid of that straight away. We don't. They can't be knowing who the married women are. Or no, it's birth notices as well. It's
oh right, yeah.
It's like okay, we can't let them know who the sexually active women are. Although, and again, what's really funny about that is that like implicitly, Gogarty's point, he seems to be conceding that like most women, if given the option, having had a child, would probably want to better regulate their fertility.
Yeah, that they would get these unsolicited packages in the post and be like, cool, yeah, I won't say anything about this. I'm okay. Yeah, happy days.
I do not want to be having any more of these.
No, I've had 5 already. Yeah, could do with the break.
Yeah, this is...
I mean, it would be a great marketing technique, but I just can't imagine it would pay off in man hours.
It feels inefficient, to say the least. But just the image of, like, you know, English, like, birth control peddlers, like, scouring the Irish Times, like, for, you know, lads, we've got a direct marketing opportunity here. That's nuts.
It's that phrase that they use in the Committee of Evil Literature all the time, birth control propaganda. It's like, I read that for ages going, what are they, like, what do they mean by propaganda? And I was like, oh, they actually believe that information about regulating your fertility is propaganda.
Yeah, just acknowledging that it is possible and, you know, that it might be beneficial under certain circumstances for certain. Because, I mean, that's the other thing. Like, you know, obviously you've had a sort of fantastic episode about Marie Stopes, but, like, someone like Stopes is very strategically conservative in the ends to which she often sort of argues that birth control, you know, should be deployed. Or there's really, as late as like 41, there's a moment where the fella's name eludes me, but a Catholic doctor who publishes a treatise endorsed by the hierarchy in, I think it's the English hierarchy rather than the Irish hierarchy, which is part of the problem here. But, you know, endorsed by Catholic bishops, publishes...
Oh, is that Halliday Sutherland?
That's the boy, yeah. Yes. He publishes this, you know, treatise on, like, here are methods of contraception that are permissible within Catholic dogma. Make of that information what you will, and includes in that basically just some, you know, relatively light justificatory explanations around how, you know, there are instances where a further pregnancy would be damaging to a woman's health or potentially fatal. There are instances where, you know, there are potentially inheritable conditions that you would not want, you know, just fairly milquetoast pragmatic arguments. And the you know, the censure board have no truck with that. Which launches one of the, I think actually the sort of the 47 reforms partly get kind of set in motion by some of the debates that are had around that, because it's a great opportunity for, like, some long-term opponents of the censorship to kind of be like, even by your own standards, like, you are now more conservative than the church you are attempting to prop up. Like, what are you doing, lads? Wasn't
it the censor who was in the Shannon at the time said that he took his inspiration from Moses, you know? So basically, like, I'm bypassing the church. And I don't know if that's allowed in Catholic theology. I don't think you can go to the Bible directly. I think that's the whole deal.
It's kind of why they have this multi-level marketing organization structure to kind of stop that.
Exactly.
Sorry, that was a very glib characterization of...
Well, it's not inaccurate. He's just like, but that's what Protestants do. Yeah. You know, they go to Moses. That's what you say is a terrible idea. I'm really confused.
I mean, like, something I suppose we also... It's worth emphasizing about some of that anti-birth control rhetoric is that it genuinely isn't confined to Ireland, right? So... you can see it in the Committee of, on Evil Literature, right? They, to their credit as a slightly odd committee, they do consult a huge, like, quite a wide array of different national precedents from, like, Australia, New Zealand, and France and Italy and so on. And, like, they are... So in some senses, they're taking a lot of their sort of template on birth. I mean, birth control is a huge issue in that their report, like, I think the longest chapter by far is the one on birth control material. But they are, you know, France in 1921 had passed legislation to prohibit the circulation of, you know, anti-conceptional literature. Mussolini's Italy, likewise, I think in about 1927, institutes kind of censorship around contraception and abortion. Obviously, Nazi Germany has, you know, the kind of Mother's Cross, like pronatalism in European nationalism in the 20s, particularly, is a big force, and Ireland betrays a kind of nationally, you know, an idiosyncratic version of that obviously is very bound up with, or is more closely bound up with the teachings of the church, and is obviously sort of reified or, like, reinforced through Casti Connubii, you know, that encyclical that where the the church explicitly outlines its arguments against contraception. But Ireland is not alone in this, and a lot of the arguments that go to justifying it are comparable. So phrases like race suicide.
Yeah, that pops up a lot.
Yeah, there's... Hold on, I'll see if I can dig up where J.J. Byrne goes off on a big old screed about it. To the vast majority of the people, the limitation, the control of births, or the infliction of race suicide upon this nation...
I mean, yeah, there's a leap.
Stealthy rhetorical sleight of hand there, my friend. Good implied synonymy. Is one that is bitterly resented. Anyone who's given it any consideration at all must see that in this matter we are behind the times. If one looks at France, America, Canada, the Commonwealth of Australia, Tasmania, New Zealand, and Victoria, he will see that action has already been taken in this particular way. There appears to be an undercurrent of feeling that birth control is more or less in the interest of this state. This, and he goes on to kind of contest that. So he says, if one might refer with all respect to the great French nation, what has happened there? The French population actually exceeded the German population in 1850. Today, the German population stands at 69 millions and the French population at 39.5 millions. Is that for the benefit of France? Does it not cause the gravest concerns to French statesmen that have the interest of their country at heart? It's does it make for the production of a better race? Ooh. And what is the effect upon a people for whom all moral responsibility, as far as the marriage tie is concerned, is removed? Now, there's a complication here, because to call that rhetoric eugenic is a moderate misnomer, because obviously eugenics is partly about, is more comfortable with birth control than that would suggest. But certainly the idea that the size of one's population is kind of, can be elided, or, stands as a sort of index of the strength and health of the nation, is I mean, eugenics is concerned with like differential birth rates in this period, so the idea that like the kind of the wrong people are more fertile than the right people. The wrong people tend to be the physically and mentally disabled and poor people, and the right people tending to be middle class people. Spoiler alert for eugenics.
I'm shocked.
I know, right? Wild, but certainly, that kind of concern about demographic decline is, as that litany of other places suggests, is pretty widespread within European nationalism at that point. And obviously, Ireland has particular reason to kind of get really anxious about that sort of those Malthusian anxieties. It comes through more strongly in like criticism of the bill, but people like Yeats explicitly alludes to it, and a few other sort of Protestant critics, a lot of the Protestant intelligentsia who comment on the bill, particularly in the pages of the Irish Times and stuff, invoke the famine as an example of what happens if the improvident overbreeders kind of are allowed to propagate themselves unchecked. And there's a not very thinly veiled sense that like, well, we saw what happened with that in 1847, which, is a nasty way to weaponize that catastrophic event. But equally, there's a kind of similar rhetoric in inverted form being deployed in some of the Catholic press as well. So you see a lot of like triumphalism in the Catholic press being like, the minority are looking like a real minority, and now that they're all using, putting things on their Mickeys, they're not going to be around for long, are they?
They're going to be outbred before they know it. They'd better watch it.
Yeah. There's an article called "Superism and Race Suicide" in the Irish Rosary.
Of course, there is.
That collocates using contraception to take in the soup.
Wow. I mean, they were so creative, really.
Hold on, let me dig it out. Just because there's some fun little swipes in there. Yeah, the crime of race suicide, notes our pseudonymous author, has gained no footing among the plain people of Ireland. That is, among the Catholic people. Yeah, thanks, Maedhbh.
Yeah. Just making a point. The only plain people we're talking about are Catholics.
Yeah. so if you look at the sort of birth rate among the peasant classes in rural areas and the proletariat of Dublin, they're all fitting well. By contrast, we're told Irish Protestants have become or are becoming tainted with the modern mania of race suicide. When they cannot afford both a baby and a motor car, they prefer the car.
Oh, well, that's ridiculous.
Yeah. Yeah, Delta argues, the person writing this does so under the pseudonym Delta, that on the unimpeachable authority of the Irish Times, that Protestants are heading for extinction by reasons of race suicide and are desperately striving to replenish their depleted ranks by methods of superism.
Oh, it's always about proselytism, isn't it? They're just absolutely paranoid that they're going to be converted.
But equally, I mean, a lot of the sort of Protestant hierarchy are really concerned that, like, ne temere will, is just a strategy to see them outbred and to kind of weaken their, intellectual and sort of cultural authority. So it's so much of this bill is actually a kind of proxy battle about who will exercise control over the sort of shape of the emerging state. To my mind, like it's really you get a lot of arguments from like Protestant critics of the bill, basically sort of arguing that because Catholics are inherently subscribed to the Roman Index Librorum Prohibitorum, that they won't be able to make up their minds freely about this topic. So it's the intellectual. There's a kind of like intellectual noblesse oblige on the part of the Protestants to kind of think this through more carefully for their benighted peers.
Their priest-ridden peers.
Yeah, and in doing so to save them from a Malthusian crisis. Sorry, I should say like Malthusianism, for those not familiar, is based on the work of the demographer Thomas Malthus, who basically was one of the most influential people to suggest that if your population size exceeds the raw materials of your nation, that's going to be a problem. And while he doesn't explicitly advocate the use of birth control, he's certainly for forms of strategic family planning, and becomes a really kind of significant figure for people who are advocating birth control, and then becomes a significant figure to push back against if you are. Yeah, it's wild. But again, it's all this like apocalyptic talk of like extinction events, and
it's so end of the world. Like, it's really weird to me in that we've just done this decade of centenaries in this great celebratory mode. But it seems like the first few years of the state are a crisis emotionally and psychologically, where everyone is like, so we've got this new state. Okay, it isn't what we wanted politically. But worse than that, it's not what we wanted at all. It's falling apart at the seams. It's a leaking ship. We're about to sink. What the fuck have we done? They're panicking,
No, totally. And that partakes of a wider kind of moral panic that's obviously emerging out of the aftermath of the First World War. That's intensified in Ireland with the War of Independence and the Civil War. And yeah, the ways in which the emergent state seeks to kind of vouchsafe its own authority and integrity through these quite kind of performative acts of moral policing, and this sense that like that those conflicts have corroded the moral character of the nation in ways that will compromise its like health and integrity are everywhere apparent in the way this stuff gets discussed. There's a kind of you see it in the Criminal Law Amendment Act stuff as well, which obviously is what ultimately like formally prohibits the sale of contraception. There's interesting ways in which that kind of that unpublished Carrigan report, which is the sort of basis for that, becomes this sort of touchstone, but also like feeds into everything from like Owen O'Duffy's kind of incipient fascism to like it's there's this real, as you say, there's this sense that if something is not done, the nation will unravel. But or like be consumed in some sort of like mass self-destructive orgy or something. Everyone will go to dance halls and
if people are partying till the wee hours and they're just having too much fun and the end of the world is upon us,
listening to jazz.
But it's interesting that, because I've been thinking about moral panics and then conspiracy theories, and I can't quite decide like which one it is primarily, because there's this sense of conspiratorial, the big baddie, like when they say propaganda, when they talk about the British are deliberately producing this stuff in order to undermine Irish people. I mean, it isn't a byproduct of their commercial enterprise. It's the raison d'etre. And so there's that, but then there's all that sewerage, which is panicky, you know. I just can't decide. It seems to oscillate between them.
I mean, one need only look at our present political moment, I think, for kind of evidence of the ways in which these more quote unquote irrational sort of negative emotions that shape political rhetoric, how they coexist with a kind of conspiratorial mindset. And obviously, you know, the reassurance that conspiratorial thinking offers is its capacity. You know, if you assume that there are forces behind everything, then nothing can surprise you and what have you. But it's, yeah, I mean, I wouldn't suggest that his views are like mainstream on this, but like you do also have instances, you know, Oliver Gogarty is pretty explicitly kind of subscribed to some version of the international Jewish conspiracy, and you know he does think that like we could devote a whole other episode to tracing the logic of how he thinks that like the jury, the quote unquote jury have like control of England and have like corrupted the English racial type, and that England is trying to like export that to Ireland through things like, you know, British militarism. I mean, this is back in like 1900, you know, the first, this pre-independence, he's sort of making these arguments, but they come back again with the birth control thing. He's like, this is once again, England is trying to kind of sap the strength of the nation and turn us into a bunch of, you know, kind of racial mongrels like them. And while that's not, I wouldn't, it would be inaccurate to kind of say that rhetoric gains much traction with other people. Like, there is something about that kind of that register of panic that, like, you know, resonates with things like the Limerick pogroms and some, you know, the kind of stuff that Devan, your man behind those, is sort of, you know, his rhetoric about contamination. And I mean, obviously partly this is just an index of how exclusionary nationalisms tend to use bodily metaphors a lot. So, you know, I don't want to confuse sort of correlation with causality, but yeah, I think there must be some compensatory sort of reassurance to be found in the idea that, like, the new state is struggling not because an emergent independent nation it has a different task ahead of it, and maybe the assumption that the English leaving would solve all of our problems was a naive one.
Yeah, I mean, it's a bit sunlit uplands, really, wasn't it?
Yeah. It's like, oh shit, no, so a lot of this might be our stuff as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's something that I observed a lot in the poor law stuff from before independence, where there was a real sense that they were just waiting. You know, they were like, well, we don't really have to figure out why this doesn't work, because once the English leave, it'll be fine, and the taxes will drop, and there will be manna from heaven every morning, and it will be absolutely great. And then the English left, and it turned out that running a welfare system is expensive, difficult, confusing, tedious, and you still have to go to committee meetings and decide if you're going to pay for roof tiles. And I think they were really disappointed, you know?
This isn't fun.
Like, it was supposed to be fixed. It was supposed to be fine. And
when do we get our hot girl summer?
Exactly. It's like, why are we still sitting here talking about how to spend the same amount of money, or in fact, even less, because we appear to be poorer because we burnt a few poor houses down and we have to pay for them now. You know? It's like they were so disappointed.
I mean, there's so much like kind of thwarted revolutionary potential as well, which is you know, sort of genuinely heartbreaking and again, you know, well documented in a lot of the sort of, you know, decade of centenary stuff, like how quickly that those potentially sort of revolutionary forces turn kind of arch conservative.
But it is really hard running things, like when you have no one to blame for the fact that it's not good.
And that kind of, I mean, also that sort of protectionism, which obviously is another thing that's sort of at play here. I mean, while I want to be careful about extolling the virtues of, economic liberalization or, free trade as a panacea, like there's a sense that obviously the kind of closed borders mindset that predominates in this, and, the effort to like kind of sustain an Irish publishing market through this as well, that's kind of going on, right? That, a lot of the contributions to this debate talk about how like there's just no hope of an Irish, particularly like periodical press competing with the kind of volume that England can turn out. So there is this there's much to be said about how like metaphors of bodily integrity coexist with multiple sort of layers of like protectionism around the nation as both cultural and sort of economic entity.
The body of the nation. It's just such an interesting concept, especially in censorship. Oh my God.
No, totally.
Although I think it was J.M. Coetzee said about the censor that they were inherently ridiculous because they were like a man who's trying to control whether his penis stands up or not.
Well, that's, I mean, we've talked before about like how one defines obscenity, but like that kind of, I know it when I see it,
yes.
And feel it. Is such a funny part. Like Beckett he has a unpublished at the time, but now available essay about censorship that he writes for the Bookman. I think we talked about in that episode where he like, talks about the Irish censor having better things to split than hairs, pubic or otherwise, or like how the particular kind of censor that the Censorship Act favors, which is the this kind of deliberately uneducated, like, kind of common sense plain person, will be at liberty to withdraw their streams from the corrupting matter before they are spent. So Beckett's like, you'll be practicing a sort of intellectual like withdrawal method as the like how the censor can kind of do their work, and it's this delicious sort of sexualized send up of even the kind of logic of censorship.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the other thing obviously that permeates a lot of this, is that there's a sort of battle over intellectual authority and like meaningful notions of cultural value and what the state's duties are in that regard. And that's something that seems to sort of weirdly unite critics of the bill and people who extol its sort of virtues. There's a sense that what everyone seems to get wrong about the effect of the bill is that it will target the kind of periodical press, mass publications, and emergent mass media. It won't touch books. And that's, obviously sort of the direct inverse of what happens a lot of the time, particularly where Irish writing is concerned. But part of that seems to be that, like the one of the things that the state is now being tasked with guaranteeing, because we're entering this phase of like the emergent welfare state, right, or a kind of interventionist new liberal state, rather than the kind of classical liberal state, that it's the job of the state to like improve the minds of its citizens, or to kind of prescribe a sort of minimum level of sort of intellectual matter for them. But then all of the kind of critics of the bill argue that like in sort of producing this like one size fits all kind of intellectual straitjacket for everyone, that the state that actually they'll produce in Ireland that is incapable of recognizing cultural excellence, which again has all of this kind of eugenic baggage in how they talk about it. So it's the whole thing is a mess. And like what you again to trail the book, like God help me,
trail away please.
One of the things that there's a tendency to at times to have framed this, the sort of battle lines over censorship as between a sort of, inherently commendable set of opponents to censorship, who are concerned with artistic liberty and opposed to this kind of pronatalism. And it's kind of unwarranted infringement on the bodily autonomy of women, and then you've got a bunch of rabid Catholic sex phobes, as Bernard Shaw terms them, mad on heresiophobia or something. But once you dig into the rhetorics that both parties are drawing on to justify their positions, it's more a difference of like degree than kind. In ways that are, that like might complicate how we think about some of the figures involved. I mean, it's no shock to anyone that that Yeats is on the is in a dubious kind of position on a lot of these topics, but it's it's sometimes easy to forget that like Shaw is an ardent eugenicist, admittedly a very weird idiosyncratic form of eugenics. I mean, Beckett doesn't at any point wholly espouse a sort of set of eugenic ideals, and he later critiques this stuff in his own writing in quite interesting ways. But but even with him, there's a sense of like the censor in his writing gets figured as like a cephalopod, cuttle squirting ooze from its. He talks about how like sterilization of the mind will bring about apotheosis of the litter. And sterilization is a loaded eugenic word. It was one of the things that was proposed for physical and mental defectives, was that you would voluntarily or involuntarily sterilize them. And the point at which he's writing that essay, there's just been the Brock Committee in the UK, which was to kind of determine whether the UK would introduce sterilization for people in sanatoria and asylums and things. So it's, yeah. Sorry, this is a real bummer note to take things up to, but like...
What, that there are no goodies and there are no baddies? I mean, I'm okay with that as a historical interpretation. That's pretty much my whole podcast. I mean, even Sean O'Fwayloin and the anti-censorship types, most people thought there was a need for some censorship. They were just like... I don't like this particular one. So it isn't so much a point of principle as a point of policy and implementation, really.
Yes. Yeah. It's, and that's another really important thing to kind of, like, the number of times there's some kind of prefatory caveat where someone says, look, some form of censorship is, of course, necessary. Even if it's just to be like, I would like there to not be the books that I don't like.
Yeah. I don't think my daughter should read books called The Golden Trollop and things like that.
Yeah, as you say, shades of grey abound. But my God, the rhetorical kind of intensity with which these things discuss the elan is like genuinely to dear listener, if you find yourself with a half hour to spare, you can go, you can access the Doyle and Shannon debates readily through the Oireachtas website, and just go through some of the censorship debates. They are wild.
They are crackers.
People lose the run of themselves talking about this stuff.
My favourite part is sometimes they're having these interpersonal spats that I have no idea what they're actually talking about. But, there's all these personal digs at each other, and they're using the policy and the principle, and they're like, well, there's
of
such
course,
drama.
My learned friend would say that. Yeah.
Yes.
A bunch of queens. It's brilliant.
Absolutely throwing shapes, I think that's a great way to end our discussion about vice and shite. There was a lot of shite, actually. I think fair dues. Yeah. Once again, Lloyd, you brought it to the table.
Jesus Christ. I mean, if I have to have a personal brand, let it be fecal.
It's your own fault for, obsessing about Joyce, really. He's perverted your mind.
Yes, I've been corrupted and depraved. The matter fell into my hands, and here we are. Well, there's a nice Senator John Keane talks about how in the intellectual development of any person, they must undergo a period of demoralization, and then they emerge from that to intelligence, as he puts it in one of his contributions to the debates. So that's the endeavour we're collectively engaged in, everyone.
Ultimately, the shite will turn out to be manure, basically, is what you're saying.
I couldn't have put it better myself.
Thank you so much.
It is always a joy. And yeah, if I can sincerely plug the book.
Plug the book. What's your working title?
So it's Irish Modernism and the Politics of Sexual Health, and I recently found out that it is under contract with OUP, so hopefully it will be sort of out within the year. But yeah, in it I look at the sort of how the medicalization and politicization of sex, you can hear how that's been permeating all the conversation we've had, how that sort of shapes Irish culture from about 1880 to about 1960. So start with the sort of the Parnell split, go through the Playboy riots, into, Ulysses and its handling of like venereal disease, Beckett and the censorship sort of debates, Kate O'Brien, the censorship debates, Flann O'Brien and the exhaustion of sexual health, by which point the reader themselves is presumably exhausted. Weirdly, it's weird how all of these chapters seem to coincide with things I've come on to talk about in this podcast.
Isn't it strange, though?
So if you want to hear, if you want to see this stuff written down, that's you can find that there in what I'm sure, because it's an academic monograph, will be a completely unaffordable form. So get your library to get it.
Yeah, ask the librarian to buy it. And
or just send me an email and I'll send you a PDF.
Well, I can't wait to read it. So I'm sure lots of people who listen to the podcast will be pestering their librarians to sign up for it as well.
I can only hope that the librarians will refuse on the basis of its smutty content.
That is a risk, I have to say. Thanks so much, Lloyd. It was great.
My absolute pleasure.
Now, just to say that season 8 is coming up in September, and I have so many great guests lined up. We will be reading pulp magazines alongside heavyweight literary authors like Graham Greene. Till then, keep your hands clean and your minds filthy.